It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speakers, Khadijah and Serena Nudell. Serena Nudell is the Manager of Mental Health and Wellness at Access Alliance Multicultural Health and Community Services. Her career has been dedicated to promoting individual and community well-being of vulnerable populations, specifically utilizing an anti-oppressive lens to address social determinants of health. With a Master of Social Work degree and a postgraduate degree in art therapy, she has been able to apply innovative strategies to ensure responsiveness of programming and high engagement of community. In her role at Access Alliance, Serena spearheaded the robust development of an overarching mental health vision and strategy bridging primary care and community programming through quality improvement initiatives. Her research has focused on supporting the mental health of racialized youth and improving access to services for LGBTQ+ newcomer women. Khadijah is the Social Justice Programming Coordinator for an Islamic Educational Center in Toronto, where she is currently producing a series of educational video shorts on systemic Islamophobia in Canada. Khadijah is also a board member for an Ontario-wide nonprofit serving Two-Spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, plus youth. She writes and speaks regularly on issues of race, gender, and sexuality, both academically and in community settings. Khadijah has previously worked in therapy and research with Two-Spirit LGBTQ+ racialized communities and looks forward to doing more work in this area. During their keynote address, Khadijah and Serena will present the project findings of Access Alliance's community-based research project Among Friends, Overcoming Systemic Discrimination and Building Positive Spaces for Lesbian, Bisexual, and Trans LGBTQ+ newcomer women, which investigated the experiences and needs of LGBTQ+ newcomers with a focus on those who came to Canada through the refugee stream. They will describe the broader socioeconomic, historical, and legal context within which LGBTQ+ newcomers and refugees arrive to and settle in Canada. Khadijah and Serena will share Access Alliance's evidence-informed model of service delivery and how they have applied the findings of this research to create safer spaces for LGBTQ+ newcomer communities. Please join me in welcoming Khadijah and Serena.
Thank you so much for having us here today. It's really our pleasure. Today, Khadijah and I are going to be presenting about Beyond Positive Intentions, providing equitable services for LGBTQ newcomers. Again, my name is Serena Nudell, and I'm the Manager of Mental Health and Wellness at Access Alliance, and my pronouns are she, her.
And my name is Khadijah Kanji. I'm a former project coordinator for this research project.
So I'd like to acknowledge our funder, the Women's Exchange from Women's College Hospital, who funded us to investigate the barriers to access for LGBTQ newcomer women. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that we experienced in the inclusion and exclusion criteria associated with this research as we get into our presentation. And I also want to acknowledge the amazing supervision that we've received from and co-investigation from the Factor in Wintosh Faculty of Social Work at University of Toronto. To begin, I'm just going to give you an overview of our presentation. We'll begin by identifying some of the terminology that we're going to be using. We're going to discuss the historical context to get us situated about LGBTQ newcomers and refugees, the reason that we have decided to engage in this workshop, this research, as well as the key findings in terms of barriers and challenges, as well as the key findings in terms of the social and health impacts, and then moving beyond positive intentions. How do we actually address and make change at a systemic level, at a service level, and at a program level? And then I'm going to discuss a little bit of work that we do at Access Alliance in order to promote positive spaces. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to my good colleague, Khadijah, to share.
Thank you, Serena. Good morning, social workers. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Tula, for your introduction. Thank you, Lisa and Sarah from the college and our tech crew, Adam and Tyler, for your excellent work. I'm very excited to be here, not only because this is probably the most socializing I've done since approximately March, but also because this research that we've embarked on is very exciting for me. So before I delve into the official portion of my presentation, we just want to go over some terminology to ensure that we're all on the same page. So LGBTQ plus newcomer women was the original subject group for our research, and we define this as any person who self-identified as a woman and as a sexual or gender minority and who had entered Canada within the past 7 years. And Serena will discuss more about some of the evolutions in our subject group and the resulting tensions from this. LGBTQ plus asylum seeker is someone who is in the process of pursuing government-recognized refugee status on the basis of persecution for their gender or sexual practice or identity. And an LGBTQ plus refugee is someone who has been through the asylum seeking process successfully and is now recognized by law as a refugee. While our research was inclusive of all LGBTQ plus newcomer women, most of our research participants were asylum seekers or refugees. And throughout my portion of the presentation, as shorthand for LGBTQ+, I'm going to be primarily using trans or queer as shorthand for anyone who diverges in terms of identity and experience from the norm in terms of gender and sexuality. While queer has historically been used as a derogatory term, it has since been reclaimed and repurposed by those who self-identify with it, although there are still groups who find it to be insulting, but I will be using it here. Okay, so before we get into the research, my portion of the presentation will be providing some of the broader context to the community in question, specifically trans and queer asylum seekers and refugees. As social workers and social service workers in the profession of administering care, it's easy for us to depoliticize our work, but there's a reason why some of us are in the position of providing care and others are in the position of needing care. And the reason for that is injustice, a global economic and political system that unequally distributes the opportunity for well-being. And if we depoliticize our work, we risk normalizing, erasing, or even legitimizing this status quo. The need for context is especially important in the case of trans and queer refugees. Trans and queer refugees are situated within a mainstream discourse to advance a nationalist narrative, one that positions the good of Canada, a place of refuge, a safe haven that's not just welcoming to sexual and gender diversity, but ethnic diversity as well. So a narrative that positions the good of Canada in binary contrast to the bad of elsewhere, places so transphobic and homophobic that people have to escape them. And so I've just included on this slide some mainstream media article headlines about trans and queer refugees that typically surface around Pride season. And I think they aptly summarize the mainstream Canadian conversation about trans queer refugees, one that positions them as the victims of their home countries who are then generously rescued by Canada. So let's complicate this discourse a little bit. So firstly, the bad country of origin narrative. Why are there trans and queer asylum seekers? Well, the origins of transphobia and homophobia in the global South are in European colonialism and primarily British colonialism. British colonizers queered their colonized populations, and by that I mean they constructed them as perverse in terms of their gender and sexuality because they failed to live up to British standards of heterosexuality, binary gender, and monogamy. Queering the colonized helped the colonial project. It dehumanized colonial subjects and made domination of them to seem natural and even altruistic as an act of civilizing. So, for example, some historical literature suggests that Indian men were considered easily colonizable because they failed to live up to standards of masculinity. That's just one example. And legislation supported this queering colonial mission. The British implemented the first colonial anti-sodomy law, so that's anti-same-sex law, into the Indian Penal Code and transplanted this law across almost every British colony. And this legacy remains. A 2014 academic study found that the majority of countries with anti-queer legislation have a British legal colonial origin, and the majority of countries with a British colonial legal origin continue to penalize queer sex and romance. Today, of course, the Europeans, and particularly the British, who exported their sexual and gender prudishness, have largely overcome its most explicit manifestation, so that many now can accept as refugees those who are escaping the very laws, practices, and mindsets that they introduced. And just as colonialism has left a legacy of transphobia and homophobia, it has also kept in place its economic imbalances, so that the economies of the West are still financed through the exploitation of the non-West. So, for example, one 2017 study by several NGOs found that sub-Saharan Africa is actually a net creditor to the rest of the world. So, despite the widespread assumption that Africa is a net recipient of loans and aid, billions more dollars actually leave the region each year through dodged taxes, repatriated profits, illegal logging, fishing, and trade in wildlife, and damages from climate change. Billions more leave each year through these mechanisms than enter it via loans and aid. Of course, none of this debt is collectible by sub-Saharan Africa because our global economy hasn't been organized to recognize these things as debts. And so while the official domination of the global South through colonialism is now not only banished, but universally frowned upon, global trade systems have taken their place to continue domination of the non-West by the West. And Canada is on the winning end of this dynamic. So what does widespread poverty in the global South have to do with transphobia and homophobia? Well, a few things. A 2012 Gallup poll, for example, found that homophobia is negatively correlated with economic development. So the poorer a region, the more negative attitudes there tend to be toward sexual minorities. And this makes sense since poverty breeds strife. When people are made to vie over meager resources, they find ways to divide themselves in order to justify material discrimination. On another point, Professor David Murray, who studies anthropology at York University, did research in Barbados, and he found that wealthy queers, so sexual and gender minorities with significant wealth, were able to better protect themselves from anti-queer violence. And this is because wealth gives people both privacy as well as social and political power. So we see here the relationships between transphobia, homophobia, and poverty. And then finally, and quite obviously, queers exist in bodies, and those bodies have material needs. Sub-Saharan Africa is the fastest migrant-producing region in the world. So whether people are leaving because of the poverty resulting from Western economic exploitation, whether they're leaving because they are queers who are suffering the legacy of Western imported transphobia and homophobia, or whether they're leaving because of both, functionally, it doesn't matter. Their homes cannot accommodate them. And so it is arbitrary for those of us concerned with queer life to limit our concern to the persecution of queers as queers. We have to be concerned with and responsive to all of the sources of violence that affects them. And So none of this is meant to excuse the transphobic and homophobic violence perpetrated against queers around the world, but it does mean that what we consider generally to be an illogical hatred of sexual and gender minorities in the global south is very much logical, and that our governments, our societies are very much implicated in this. So now to add some context to the perception of Canada as the good country of refuge. Amid news of the notorious Trump Muslim ban in the US in 2017, Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, famously tweeted, "To those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you regardless of your faith." Yet, despite this very generous tweet, Canada kept intact the Safe Third Country Agreement with the US. The Safe Third Country Agreement prevents asylum seekers who land in the US from crossing into Canada through a formal border crossing in order to claim asylum in Canada. And so the logic behind this agreement is that the US is a safe haven for refugees, and therefore, if you are an asylum seeker entering the US, you can safely file for asylum there and therefore do not need to enter into Canada to do so. The Muslim ban did not apparently make Canada reconsider the US as a safe haven. Neither did news that Trump's presidency was separating refugee children from their families en masse and locking them up in detention centers. Neither did Trump's rhetoric and construction of a border wall against Mexico. Neither did Trump's cancellation of the temporary protected status provisions, which allowed people to stay in the US if their home countries had been ravaged through war or famine. The Safe Third Country Agreement, however, doesn't actually stop asylum seekers from entering Canada from the US. And I remember here the words of the brilliant Black poet Warsan Shire, who put it this way: "No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." So people who need safety will seek it. As more asylum seekers try to enter Canada in response to the Muslim ban and Justin Trudeau's tweet, RCMP officers sent back over 20,000 asylum seekers trying to enter Canada from the US that year in 2017 through official crossings. Those who want to make it successfully into Canada have to instead enter through unofficial ports of entry. And these are often dangerous routes, and many of us have read media reports of people who have lost limbs to frostbite and even died trying to enter into Canada through these unofficial ports. As refugee advocates have noted, the Safe Third Country Agreement makes Canada actively complicit in America's violation of refugee rights. As a result, the Safe Third Country Agreement was recently struck down by the Supreme Court for violating the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and our federal government is appealing this. So that our government can explicitly acknowledge the violence of American refugee and immigration policy through tweets, but materially will refuse to do anything about it, will actually fight for the right in the Supreme Court to refuse to do anything about it, reflects just how hypocritical and superficial is Canada's benevolence. Now consider another point of hypocrisy: the refusal to recognize climate refugees, the millions around the world who have been made homeless and jobless as a result of climate change. Canada is directly responsible for the production of climate refugees. In fact, as a country, we emit more carbon per person than any other G20 economy. And from tar sands operations at home to mining projects abroad, we have benefited from a global economy organized around environmental destruction. Meanwhile, the poorest half of the world's population is responsible for just 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and yet developing countries will bear up to 80% of the costs of the climate crisis. And so while we are all impacted by the pending doom of climate change, we can see how the current framework of injustice in our world has organized who is bearing the cost of it. But despite Canada's role in the production of climate refugees, Canada, and no country actually, recognizes them as bona fide asylum claimants, and so will send them back to where they came from. The same with economic refugees. so-called economic refugees. Again, Canada directly produces economic refugees. So in Haiti, for example, Canada actually played an instrumental role in the 2004 Haitian coup and in then implementing a neoliberal economic restructuring program that pushed many more Haitians into poverty. But because economic refugees are also not recognized by law, in 2017, Canada sent over 500 people back to Haiti, with many more in the line to be deported. Canada sent people back to Haiti on the grounds that they were not legitimate asylum seekers. Once asylum seekers are in Canada, Canada's approach is that they are effectively fraudulent until proven refugee. They are effectively criminalized. They can be forced to regularly check in with Canadian Border Services agencies to ensure they don't disappear. And they can be held in indefinite administrative detention, aka prison. And this includes children. And in these administrative detention spaces, queer asylum seekers are made particularly vulnerable to sexual and gendered violence. And so we also see here how lack of citizenship status also distributes our rights. No one who is a Canadian citizen can be indefinitely held in administrative detention, and no Canadian citizen child would certainly be allowed to be held in indefinite administrative detention. At the refugee hearing, asylum seekers are forced to relive their most painful life experiences in order to prove that they are legitimate. And for trans and queer asylum seekers, the method for proving their queerness has been critiqued as highly invasive and based on false stereotypes about what queers look like and what queers do. And after all of this, asylum seekers can be deported if they fail to prove their persecution adequately to a refugee panel. Canada, amid the onset of this pandemic, closed its borders to non-essential travel, and this apparently included refugees whose life or death journeys were deemed non-essential by our government. And this is reflective of Canada's approach to refuge. It should happen only on grounds that are utterly convenient for Canada, human welfare not considered. We don't often hear about these injustices of the refugee system, or when we do, they're written off as administrative hiccups within the larger narrative of Canadian refugee benevolence. But that 84% of refugees are actually hosted in developing countries, not the wealthy countries that have in large part produced them, reflects the extent to which Canada's narrative of refugee benevolence is far from the whole story. Trans and queer asylum seekers who are successful in the refugee applications become trans and queer Canadians, a title which statistically doesn't suggest they will experience safety, security, and well-being. Even though our Prime Minister will happily march in a pride parade, and despite the unparalleled internationally unparalleled rights and protections available to sexual and gender minorities in this country, trans and queer people are more likely to live in poverty and to experience homelessness. They are one of the biggest targets of hate crimes, violence, bullying, and familial rejection. Trans and queer people are discriminated against in social services, most notably in healthcare, where trans people in particular report having less access to appropriate services. Unsurprising, then, that trans and queer people should be disproportionately represented in statistics of depression, addiction, and suicide. And while queers are made objects of political and academic debate, they are underrepresented as subjects of political debate. So it wasn't until 2017 that Canada even elected its first trans mayor. And while trans and queer people make up about 13% of the Canadian population, they make up just over 1% of federal members of parliament. And of course, these negative outcomes are worse when LGBTQ plus is disaggregated. So people who are trans and gender nonconforming, and those who are additionally marginalized by race, class, ability, and immigration status have even worse outcomes. These contradictions between official celebration of queerness and negative lived reality in Canada are in part attributable to the effects of capitalism. So, for example, queer youth are overrepresented in statistics of homelessness. And we often understand this in terms of domestic transphobia and homophobia, so that when queer kids come out to their families, they are evicted from their homes. But rather than only ask why people are so hateful that they would evict their queer children from their families, we should perhaps instead ask, why does someone being kicked out of their home mean that they should become homeless? It is because our economic system doesn't protect any of us from poverty that trans and queer people are made so vulnerable to interpersonal discrimination. We don't need to end homophobia and transphobia to end queer homelessness. We need to end homelessness to end queer homelessness. And this is part of the limitations of our identity politics approach to addressing transphobia and homophobia, and the lack of economic or structural analysis. Trans and queer asylum seekers become trans and queer Canadians, and they become trans and queer Canadians on stolen land. As Canada liberalized its immigration policy in 1967 to remove explicit racial preferences, as Canada adopted an official policy of multiculturalism, as Canada signed on to the Refugee Convention, as Canada has increasingly invited non-whites from around the world to become Canadian, the ongoing settler colonial project has been obscured because Canadian settlers now come in many different shades. Non-white immigrants experience racism and denial from the Canadian state, and refugees have come here to escape their own oppression. But we are still made complicit by virtue of our Canadian status in ongoing colonialism against the land's original inhabitants. And yes, colonialism isn't a historical project, but a current one. And Tula read out a land acknowledgement in recognition of this ongoing obligation we have towards reconciliation and decolonization. But as long as Indigenous peoples have to move through a colonial legal system to have their basic land claims recognized, as long as they aren't even allowed to protect their own lands from destruction or avail of their waters without violence, as we're seeing now in Nova Scotia, as long as Indigenous peoples don't have guaranteed access to clean air or water, as long as they are subject to police brutality, incarceration, and child apprehension, as long as Indigenous peoples are victimized in public discourse and subject to interpersonal violence, as long as Indigenous peoples are colonized, those of us with settler status, whatever color we come in, are made complicit in their oppression. And of course, this doesn't discount the rights of asylum seekers to access safety or to suggest that everyone is equally responsible for the settler colonial project. It does, however, point to the foundational contradiction of Canadian good. Canada's refugee program doesn't unsettle its settlement. If anything, it just obscures it. And I just want to end here with the words of Guardian journalist Anders Lustgarten, who I think put it well, as he wrote, "Refugees don't need our tears. They need us to stop making them refugees." Canada has the capacity and willingness to accept refugees for the same reason that others are in need of refuge: a global economic and political system that deprives and dominates the many for the abundance of the few. Dominant discourse allows Canada to benefit from a system that systematically produces displaced and disenfranchised people while extracting moral currency for granting conditional and limited entry to some of its victims. Thank you. And now I will pass it along to Serena, who will share in more detail about our research project.
Thank you so much, Khadijah. It's really important for us to understand the context that we are conducting this research and why people are coming to Canada as refugee claimants that are members of the LGBTQ community. And so why did we decide to embark on this research? Access Alliance serves up to 300 LGBTQ newcomers a year, and we want to be able to provide the highest quality services, reflective services. We want to provide inclusive services. And embarking on the research, we saw that there's a growing body of evidence that shows systemic barriers, discriminations, and persecution and violence faced by LGBTQ groups. But there is limited research on the experiences of those of LGBTQ newcomers and refugees, particularly LGBTQ newcomer women. So we thought it would be important to contribute to that research and the work that we do. So to begin with, I would like to discuss the research process that we embarked on. It's a community-based research project, which means that we recruit peer researchers to participate in the research. We really try to create an inclusive research process. But however, in the same way that community-based research can produce wonderful, rich evidence, also there are some inherent challenges in community-based research in terms of funding, in terms of time, in terms of staffing, and those are some of the experiences that we faced during this project. And thankfully, we were able to overcome them to collect some really rich data that we're interested in sharing. One of the important things to discuss, and perhaps the biggest challenge in this research project, came into play when we were developing the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So the research project, focusing on moving beyond positive intentions, how do we improve access for LGBTQ newcomer women? That was the focus of the research that we embarked on. And in order to do this research, we needed to develop an inclusion criteria of who would be able to participate in this research. And so we sat down with the research committee, the advisory committee, and we began to think about who would be important to include. And so what we decided to do was to include anybody who was interested in participating, who identified as an LGBTQ newcomer woman, and we decided also to include trans men and gender non-binary individuals. Now, the reason that we decided to do that was because they may have had an experience of womanhood, or we didn't want to put up a boundary on who could participate because not everybody identifies as male or female. So we decided to go ahead with this methodology and inclusion, and did our recruitment, did our focus groups. We analyzed the research. However, as I mentioned with challenges in community-based research, when we got to the point where we were interested in doing knowledge mobilization, we had run out of funding, so we had brought in some new people to support, some new academics to support in the development of a report. And there were people that were present at the meeting that were not present at the initial meeting. And we got into a very important and rich discussion that is quite valuable to the work that we're doing. And important as social workers that we always reflect on the work that we do. You know, as Khadijah presented, you know, we have to look at the bigger context. And so while our intention was to be inclusive by including trans men and gender nonconforming individuals, to present this research as barriers to access for LGBTQ newcomer women would be misgendering people that were included in the focus groups, because we did include gender non-binary and we did include trans men in those focus groups. And at this point, it's difficult to de-identify the data. It's already been analyzed. So we may ask, you know, why would a trans man or a non-binary individual want to participate in this research? Why would they be interested? And it's important to reflect on what may have been the reason. Potentially, it could have been because, as Khadijah had discussed, and I'm going to discuss further, the socioeconomic barriers for somebody, $20, which is a sort of standard honorarium for participation in research, may be a huge incentive for somebody to participate. Particularly, that money could mean, you know, food, it could mean basic necessities. So there could have been that incentive that made them interested to participate. There could have been because the majority of the participants were or they were all newcomers. There may have been some with language barriers or who did not understand the terminology, and that's why they decided to participate. Also, there are so few forums for LGBTQ newcomers to share their voice and to share their experience and be heard. That may have been a reason, even though they may not have identified specifically with the group. They decided to participate. So I think it's important to recognize that this research is really valuable. And I'm going to go into more detail about the amount of interviews and focus groups that we did, but we collected a lot of really valuable information, and we really need to honor the voices, the people that shared their voices. We have to recognize that the research is not perfect, and as social workers, we are responsible for self-reflection, and so being completely transparent that we did have this challenge in the inclusion criteria, but yet we would like to move forward and share the valuable findings that we had. So as I mentioned, Access Alliance serves over 300 LGBTQ newcomers and refugee claimants a year. Most of them are from African and Caribbean countries, and many of the participants in these focus groups were recruited from Access Alliance community as well as partner communities. So we were able to conduct 16 one-on-one interviews with service providers of LGBTQ newcomer women. We were able to conduct 3 focus groups for a total of 30 participants, including LGBTQ newcomer women, femme, and also trans and gender nonconforming individuals. One focus group was specifically dedicated towards trans people. And we were able to do 3 in-depth interviews with LGBTQ newcomer women and 1 gender nonconforming newcomer. We had peer researchers conducting this research. One was an LGBTQ trans newcomer, and one was a trans woman, and one was an LGBTQ newcomer woman. And without further ado, I'm going to get into the findings. So what we see is that many LGBTQ newcomers come to Canada escaping persecution, escaping oppression, violence in their country of origin, and mostly fleeing to Canada, and have very high hopes for a life of safety, security, health, and prosperity. But little by little, what they encounter when they actually arrive is many systemic barriers, which leads to a disintegration of hope. So the key experiences that we found in our research was a lack of access to safe and affordable housing, economic and employment insecurity, as well as social isolation. So these are the key overarching themes that we are going to be addressing today. Some minor themes that we also saw is the insecurity and stress associated with the refugee claim process. Individuals come here hoping to have a safe settlement journey, but the wait to have their refugee claim is filled with insecurity. It's filled with fear about having to return to the country where their life is potentially at risk. So one more point I'd like to make is that these experiences of lack of affordable, safe housing, as well as employment and economic insecurity and social isolation, are very common in the immigrant and refugee experience. But gender, sexual orientation, and race together really influence these factors and really make individuals experience them more acutely. And I hope that through the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be able to describe the unique elements that are experienced by LGBTQ newcomers. So the first point I'd like to discuss is housing. So as I mentioned, many times, most of the time, LGBTQ newcomers are fleeing their country of origin, bringing very few possessions with them, and have very few to no contacts when they arrive. So most often, the first stop is the shelter system. And the shelter system is unfortunately characterized by negative experiences. I need to say that not all shelters are the same, but many people that were interviewed had negative experiences within the shelter system. And the majority of these negative experiences come from language barriers, not actually having interpretation at the shelter, as well as people at the shelter being not understanding of the refugee claim process and not being able to provide support, as well as direct and indirect discriminatory treatment. And some of these discriminatory treatment may be to do with misgendering, as I previously discussed, not understanding the experience of trans people as well. For example, one of our participants mentioned that they needed to use a razor in order as part of their life as a trans person, but unfortunately in the shelter system, they were not able to have a razor because of it would have been dangerous. And another woman in the group experienced a lack of understanding from the shelter staff because she had a child and she was LGBTQ newcomer with a child, and there was a lack of understanding about how that would be possible. So the shelter system is a negative experience, and then unfortunately this continues when the newcomers are looking to find housing, and they continue to experience discrimination from landlords. Now, another interesting point to make is that most often the LGBTQ community is downtown, and that's where housing is most expensive. So oftentimes people are forced into isolation by moving outside of the downtown core, where there's very few community members and they're often alone. And also they've characterized living outside of the downtown core as feelings of unsafe, that the communities that they live in aren't accepting of LGBTQ newcomers. So these are some of the challenges associated with housing. So the other main factor that was discussed amongst participants was economic insecurity as being a major challenge. As I mentioned earlier, most often LGBTQ refugee claimants are fleeing, coming here with absolutely nothing, as well as very few employment prospects. So they're arriving here experiencing food insecurity, lack of clothing, lack of sanitary products. Basically, all of their basic necessities are hard for them to find. They've left everything behind. And finding employment in order to support them to earn money becomes an ongoing challenge. Oftentimes, people flee their country of origin because of homophobia and within their community, and they come to Canada, and whereas sometimes newcomers are able to find supports within their cultural community, many times LGBTQ newcomers find further isolation and segregation from their own cultural community, which leaves them very isolated. And because they're coming here, they have very few places to make friends and make contacts, so it makes finding a job really difficult. They lack those professional networks, and they lack a starting place to be able to connect them to opportunity. And similarly, on that note, oftentimes we take for granted having community around us to take care of a child if you need to get to an interview quickly. Oftentimes, because of their isolation, they don't have any help around the house, or help with their children, or help to get to employment opportunities. So economic insecurity is a major issue. Now, these factors that I mentioned are really enhanced by experiences of social isolation. So, as I mentioned, making social connections is a real challenge because of racism, because of transphobia, homophobia, stigma associated with language barriers, and because of lacking income. So all of these together combine to form interlocking barriers for people to build friendships in community. They're unable to go out and meet people because they lack the income to do so. And they also described experiences while they're grateful for services provided by mainstream LGBTQ organizations. Oftentimes they don't feel welcome in those spaces. They don't, because they don't have the proper social location, and because of factors such as race and language, they don't always feel included and welcome in these mainstream spaces. So how do these factors impact people? The results of lacking of economic insecurity, of lacking housing and employment, of lacking community. They have tremendous social and health impacts on LGBTQ newcomers. And this can lead to depression, trauma, and post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as feelings of worthlessness, feeling invisible, feeling not recognized, feeling not heard. People have high levels of stress. They're completely overwhelmed by the immigration process and the settlement process. And also there's experiences of gender dysphoria and confusion from being misgendered. So there is a negative cycle that we can see here because of these feelings of worthlessness, because of depression, because of barriers. People don't have the motivation, don't have the confidence to engage in finding employment, to engage in reaching out to try and build community. They become worn down. Their sense of hope becomes disintegrated. And this is what we were seeing so often with the individuals that we interviewed. So what can we do? How can we help? And in this presentation, we're going to share the service gaps that we found through the research with the service providers, with the LGBTQ newcomers, as well as with the literature review that we did. And we're going to provide some real tangible strategies for overcoming these systemic barriers and gaps. So at a program level, one of the main gaps that we saw was a lack of peer support groups specific to women and to gender, trans, and gender nonconforming people. So what do we need to do? We need to create safe spaces and peer support groups. These peer support groups reduce social isolation that we identified earlier as such a huge determinant of health. They reduce the negative impacts of discrimination and insensitive treatments. People are able to get together and share their experience and realize they're not alone. This increases their sense of self-esteem and self-worth. And also, it's an opportunity for people to clarify their identity in terms of gender and sexual orientation. As we mentioned, often there is experience of misgendering. And also, because people are coming from other countries, they may not have the same terminology in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity that we have here. So to be able to get together and to discuss amongst themselves through peer leadership, having somebody lead who's understanding of their experiences. What we found is that during the focus groups, people really enjoyed participating and sharing their experiences with each other. They found it incredibly helpful, and they asked, when are we able to do this again? When can we get together again with these people in this group? Because finally they were able to connect with others who had similar experiences. Another benefit of peer support groups allows people to learn about what programs and services and resources are available. They're able to see which programs, which services are LGBTQ inclusive, which employers, which employment centers are really willing to put an extra effort to engage and promote LGBTQ newcomers and help them overcome those systemic barriers. And also to provide a platform for collective action on issues of shared concern. So many times people come in experiencing these issues, and unless they share their experiences, they're not actually able to make those systemic changes. So some more program level suggestions that we saw, and I'm just going to highlight a few, is that in the shelter system, there are so many opportunities for improving services for LGBTQ newcomers and newcomers in general. Language interpretation would be incredibly helpful to have people communicate their needs, as well as support for the refugee claim system and the shelter system, as well as connections, settlement support, helping people to connect with employment, helping people to connect with housing, as well as timely access to health and mental health services and the provision of basic needs. So at a service level. So what we see is that services are not inclusive and understanding of the entire identity of clients, including how wellness is impacted by intersecting and multiple determinants. So how can we develop a framework and model in which these programs and services are delivered to meet the needs and promote well-being of LGBTQ newcomer women? How can we understand that an LGBTQ newcomer woman may have been married in her country of origin, she may have had children, she may have been experiencing domestic violence, she may be experiencing racism after arriving in Canada? How do we see that all these intersecting factors, that a person can be LGBTQ and they can be a newcomer, and how do we support them and understand that, yes, race, sexual orientation, and gender identity are social determinants of health, but they're social determinants of health not by the very sake that they are, because of the impacts and the marginalization people experience who are racialized, who are gender and sexual identity minorities. Because of that, that's the discrimination and lack of access and barriers. That's what contributes to them poorer health outcomes. So how do we move beyond positive intentions and ensure that our programs are more inclusive? So at a macro and systems level, it's really important to see in agencies how policies, organizational models and culture, and program services are not consistently grounded on principles of equity. And there's a lack of recognition that gender and sexual orientation are integral social determinants of health indicators. So at an organizational level, how do we address this? First of all, this work needs to be done at all levels. It needs to be done from the executive director or CEO right down to the reception and including the board of directors. Everybody needs to be understanding and on board in terms of creating LGBTQ newcomer inclusive and friendly services, because inadvertently we can create barriers and create unfriendly spaces if those decisions, if that training, if that understanding is not throughout the organization. All it takes is one receptionist to misgender somebody to have the feeling that the environment is not inclusive and not supportive. And that training and those decisions need to be made from the higher levels. Another important thing we need to do is collect socio-demographic data to ensure our services are equitable and planned. What's really important here, and this takes a lot of reflection, is that the tools that we use to collect the data need to be reflective of the people that we're serving. It needs to be reflective of their sexual orientation and gender identity. We need to be there needs to be a box that's representative of them, for them to be able to for us to be able to properly collect that data in order for us to properly serve the community. Another really important factor is adopting and deepening equity-based hiring practices so that we can increase representation from LGBTQ newcomers within staff. And in doing so, to really listen to their needs. You know, it's one thing to hire LGBTQ newcomer staff, but we also need to hear what they're saying, what their clients are saying about how they're being served, and really take that feedback in. As social workers, one of our greatest skills is listening, reflecting, and then we need to do advocacy to make change. We need to meaningfully engage LGBTQ newcomers and LGBTQ newcomer women in advisory boards and in guiding capacity. They need to have meaningful roles where they actually have the capacity to make change. So I'm just going to do a time check. Okay. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit about Access Alliance, where I work. And Access Alliance Multicultural Health and Community Services is a community health center. And as I mentioned, we have a robust LGBTQ newcomer program. And the work that we do in the LGBTQ newcomer program is ongoing, and we don't do it independently. We work very closely with other organizations in order to constantly reflect on our practices, and we recognize we do the best job we can, but our work is never done. So one of the things that we do at Access Alliance is hire representatives of the population, including board of directors and senior leadership. So right now, 2 out of 3 members of senior leadership are members of the LGBTQ newcomer community, and both LGBTQ newcomer community health workers are gender non-binary, and we really take gender non-binary newcomers, and we really find it important to have that feedback and to have that understanding from staff members. And another interesting thing is that until recently, we had very limited amount of funding in order to do the work that we do. So in order to leverage that funding, so our funding is from the Newcomer Support Program from the Government of Ontario. How do we take that funding and incorporate it within the organization? How do we have our doctors and nurses, nurse practitioners trained in order to provide care, trans-inclusive care? How do we ensure that our counselor therapist team is understanding of the individuals that LGBTQ newcomers face? And that also goes into hiring members of the community. One more important thing that we do at a systems level is the understanding how economic security is a key social determinants of health. So as a community research department, we have done a lot of advocacy for ensuring that people receive a fair wage. And we know that through ensuring that people receive a fair wage, that's a systemic change that we can make that has ripple down effects to the overall health of individuals. So that's something that Access Alliance has been constantly involved in. At a service level, we provide prioritized access to primary healthcare services for LGBTQ newcomers based on their vulnerability. And it's important also to note that one of the systemic barriers that we do experience is that the medication that trans newcomers need for their transition is not presently covered by OHIP. So that's one thing that we are not able to support with. But it is something that we're aware of, and what can we do to be of support to the trans newcomer community? We also engage in sectoral tables, as I mentioned. There's so much amazing work being done for LGBTQ newcomers in the city of Toronto, and we need to support each other. And I think as a network, we try and not have our programs on the same night so that LGBTQ newcomers can access programs at different locations and really ensure that they're not experiencing isolation and supporting each other to deliver these services. So at a programs level, what do we do? So we provide one-on-one and group programming for LGBTQ newcomers supporting their settlement. And right now those services are online because of the pandemic. We also have a therapeutic program that is very supportive of LGBTQ newcomers. So one program that we found particularly beneficial was a narrative therapy group for LGBTQ refugee claimants. And as Khadijah had mentioned, so often when LGBTQ newcomers are going through the refugee claim process, they really need to tell a story of victimization, of fear, and demonstrate the need they have for coming to Canada, which transforms their narrative into one where they appear to be weak or victims. However, what this program focused on was changing the narrative to focus on their strengths, to demonstrate the resilience, to show them what they have overcome in order for them to come to Canada, in order for their settlement journey, to show what they've gone through in their settlement journey. So it's really an empowering group that they are participating in. And so we've had great success through that group and also through building community. Other therapeutic programs that we're offering now that are important are we have an LGBTQ newcomer dance program where we are engaging a social worker as well as an organization called Wind in the Leaves Collective. And so the Wind in the Leaves Collective are members of the African diaspora, and they support our clients to expressively tell stories about their journey to Canada using dance. And so we know that there is so much trauma within this group. So this is a really effective way, as we understand trauma is contained in the body, to express ourselves, for them to express themselves and tell their story through dance. So stay tuned. We're actually running this program right now, and we'll be sharing performances hopefully in the new year. So we're also engaged in a peer-led co-design project that's funded by Toronto Urban Health, where we're trying to understand and develop a sexual health program. It's a peer-led program. How do we engage the community to see what programming really meets their needs in terms of sexual health? So we're in the process of developing that now, and we have 4 peer leaders who are supporting us with that. One of the really important things that we have done that's helped make this program so successful is the development of a code of conduct that's read at the beginning of each group to really ensure the safety of the group, that homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, none of it's tolerated in the group, that everybody has a place in this group and that everybody's opinions are valid. And we need to give space to everybody to share their stories and share what's meaningful to them. As well as to respect the fact that you're coming here to make friends, but you can't demand friendship. It's up to people to feel comfortable if they want to make friends. You know, there is so much. We really have to be respectful of the confidentiality of the clients in their group. They may not be out to their community. They may not be out to their family. So we really have to be very sensitive to the needs of the group and really give them the space, be trauma informed, and move at their own pace. And also another interesting project that we're working on right now is in partnership with Toronto Neighbourhood Centre's Rainbow Alliance Group. And so we're collaboratively developing a Don't Assume workshop to share with service providers to educate people about misgendering. Sexual orientation and gender identity is something that needs to be understood in organizations. And what can we do to avoid misgendering people? This is something that's an ongoing work for many people. It's starting to be talked about, but it needs to be done completely at an organizational level. And finally, the Pride March. So every year, Access Alliance marches with Toronto Neighbourhood Centres to engage in the Pride Parade. And so here's a picture of us marching now. Everybody develops banners. For so many people, this is their first experience of Pride. It's very exciting to be out, proud, marching, developing signs. Everybody develops their own signs. And also, you know, there is risk with all the parties and fun happening during Pride. We also take a harm reduction approach and just provide education. And again, it's really important for us to put this into context of how Pride started as a movement of resistance and for people to understand the power in engaging in Pride activities. So those are just a few of the things that Access Alliance does. I'd be interested if you want to contact me. I'd be happy to follow up and discuss more. So thank you so much. Again, it's our pleasure to share our research and the reflective process that we've gone through with it. And so here is Khadijah's information and my information. And now we're going into questions. So please feel free to ask us some questions. We would love to address them.
Thank you very much, Khadijah and Serena, for providing such an impactful, relevant, and insightful presentation. Like me, I'm sure all of you found this information valuable. As I mentioned previously, the Educational Forum is being live streamed to members across the province. Members are able to participate in this keynote question period by entering their questions into the Call for Questions field at the bottom of this webpage. In order to accommodate questions from as many members as possible, we would ask that you limit yourself to one question only. I would now like to ask Sarah Chaudhry, the college's communications manager, to read some of your questions.
Thank you, Tula. So we received a few questions during the keynote address. The first is from member Kamal Gassim, who has asked, I have noticed on some nonprofit web pages, it's illustrated that they are a safe space for LGBTQ plus newcomers. However, their services do not explicitly address how they are positive spaces or have services specifically targeted towards LGBTQ plus individuals. Do you have any suggestions of how to address this at a micro level?
I think that's a great question, Kamal, and I think it is reflective of as our cultures evolve and as there is a growing awareness of the marginalization of sexual and gender minorities and racial minorities as well, that it is easy to end up tokenizing these values and representing them in cute stickers or slogans without actually any kind of substance behind them. I think Serena will probably actually have a better suggestions for actually engaging with this. But I think a positive way forward is to, if this is an agency that you are actually working in or employed in or accessing services from, is to speak to people that you have access to who are working there, who are in your orbit. I don't think change happens quickly or smoothly or even in large increments, but I think that that slowly we can hopefully shift a culture that is beyond tokenistic. And sorry, Serena, I think maybe you probably have more to add because you have more agency experience than I do in this regard. So
Yeah, I just to add to what Khadijah said, everything that she said, I am full agreement with. From an agency level, it's interesting that you should mention that, Kamal. We started Toronto Neighborhood Centres. I'm not sure what part of Ontario you live in, but Toronto Neighborhood Centres has a group called Rainbow Alliance Group. And I remember our first meetings when we came together and where people had that feeling. They say, I'm a staff in an organization and we have a rainbow flag hanging, but it doesn't feel like a safe place. And I don't want to have this rainbow flag as an organization right now. We're not ready for this rainbow flag. And since then, we've gotten together as agencies to reflect, there's power in numbers, there's power in coming together, in sharing resources and sharing best practices and developing presentations and bringing it back to your organization. So if you are in Toronto and you are part of a Toronto neighborhood group, get in touch. Also, Ontario Council for Agencies Serving Refugees, which serves all of Ontario, has some amazing resources in their as part of their Positive Spaces program. So I would really look into OCSWSSW's Positive Spaces program because they have audits, they have tools, they have supports, and I'm sure they would be willing to support.
Thank you both. So we received a French question from member Myriam Desmarquis. So I'm going to read it in French as the question came in, and then I'll also provide a translation. Malgré que le projet s'est concentré sur les adultes, comment peut-on utiliser les résultats et les observations de cette recherche pour l'intervention auprès des adolescents LGBTQ, en particulier les services communautaires ou en milieu scolaire? So the question in English, despite the fact that the project focused on adults, how can we use the results and observations from this research for intervention with young adults and teenagers who identify as LGBTQ+, specifically within community services and within the schools?
Okay. So again, I'll just say something and let Serena jump off if she has more to add. I think often, when we conduct research, there's the assumption that we're developing an expertise about a community. But I think it's probably more useful for us to imagine research as a process of unlearning all the ways that we have been socialized into perpetuating marginalization, so that we have been socialized into heteronormativity. We have been socialized into cisnormativity and into white normativity and into racism and transphobia and homophobia, and the work is really on us in unlearning this. So we know that queer children are particularly exposed to interpersonal violence, to bullying and familial rejection, and I think the onus is on us as adults, not to think of this in terms, not to think of changing this in terms of interventions, but in actually in actually rolling back our interventions, right? So we need to make, we need to learn how, as a society, to not impose gender normativity on children. I think a really excellent example of that is gender reveal parties, right? Which take for granted the gender binary and take for granted that the gender you're assigned to at birth is relevant towards your personhood, right? Like these are things that we need to be doing. And so I think we should, rather than think of the site of intervention as young people, but as a society that is very much organized around a particular gender and sexual manifestation. That's my more academic and intellectual answer. But I think, and I think that there are some practical practices to accompany that, that maybe Serena wants to share. But I do also want to make that point about what we consider to be our role and what we consider to be who needs intervention into. If you had anything to add.
Yeah. I completely agree with Khadijah. I think that the findings are definitely helpful from an organizational and structural perspective. I think when we're dealing with youth, we are also often thinking about the family or the impact of separation from the family. And so I think that that's another layer that we need to look into when we're looking at supporting youth. And I know that there are other agencies that are doing really interesting work. I know Children's Aid Society of Toronto is one that I know we've worked collaboratively with. And I think so I would say that this research is relevant, but I think more specific research needs to be done, or more evidence needs to be looked at in ensuring that we're completely understanding of the experiences of youth within the context of their family.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions coming in. So the next question is from Ali Tucky. It's a quick question for Khadijah. So what are Khadijah Kanji's pronouns? They were not said in the intro, and I would like to make sure we all know what they are so we can get them right.
Oh, okay. Thank you. And my apologies. I should have mentioned them there. She, her. Thank you.
Thank you, Khadijah. Next question is from Shawnette Anderson. Hello, thank you so much for the presentation. Will the research that you mentioned be available or posted on a web page at any time in the future? I would like to get a copy and share it with my organization.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And so we're actually, as I mentioned, some of the challenges in community-based research and figuring out the details of how to move forward with knowledge mobilization. We're in the process of developing we want to develop a journal article on the research. So if you could send me your email address, and when I will definitely keep you posted. In the meantime, I can share you the report that we've written so far.
Thank you. And I'll forward that particular question over to you, Serena, just so that you have it as well in their contact information.
Okay, thank you.
So the next question that we have is more of a comment or suggestion from Shala Yagubian. One of my suggestions is to have a flyer of information in the airport for newcomer clients. Some of the immigrants, when they arrive to Canada, it takes so long for them to find this information, specifically when they are from LGBTQ plus communities.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Shala. And often when people arrive at the airport, there's very little instruction or direction. So I think absolutely. Thank you.
A question from Jacqueline Lynn. How can we be more responsive to these issues within a healthcare setting, such as regional hospitals, where LGBTQ2S issues are not prioritized, especially in forms and where the milieu is very much medical model? The physicians I work with have their own homophobia to deal with.
Okay, and again, maybe if Serena has something to add, but again, I just also want to caution about the way that we frame these things, right? I don't think it's that healthcare doesn't prioritize queer trans issues. I think it's that our healthcare system is organized around the assumption of heterosexuality and monogamy and cisgender, right? So for example, when we fill out medical forms, there's usually an option of whether or not we're male or female and no alternative options. There is the assumption in the doctor's office that if we are engaging in sex, that it is cis heterosexual sex. The organization Transpulse, so if you want to check that out, has done some excellent research and produced some excellent resources on the kind of violence that's experienced by trans people in the healthcare setting, precisely because of the assumption of cisness and heterosexuality. And so I think, for example, Sherborne Health Centre hosts this module for doctors that is produced by Rainbow Health Ontario as a kind of extra curriculum as part of professional development for doctors to us LGBTQ plus communities. But there does exist those practical resources for actually making our services more accessible. But I think our first step is to just at the very least acknowledge that this isn't about introducing queerness into the healthcare setting. It's actually just about serving the people who exist and who enter our spaces and who have a right to access healthcare, and trying to undo the embedded heteronormativity and cisnormativity that is in our society.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to comment, because we're at Access Alliance, I'm going to take my mask off. At Access Alliance, we're a community health center, and the process doesn't happen overnight. It involves constant reflection on the part of the organization. And, in terms of data collection, we work very hard to ensure that our intake forms are inclusive, but there's always more work to do. We get feedback and we keep changing it to improving it, quality improvement initiatives. I know many organizations are taking more of an interest and are have diversity inclusion representation, have directors of diversity and inclusion. And I wonder if that's a good place to start, because I think so often we need to make these changes at a systemic level. You know, so often frontline staff or managers can get together and discuss these issues, but the change really needs to be at a board level or at the level of the executive director or CEO. And for those changes to make, there has to be an intention. And I think oftentimes inclusion and diversity officers or directors may be a place to start. And definitely a good place to start is to look at the forms and to look at what work is being done. And again, these audits, organizational audits, you know, that OCSSW has developed, those would be applicable also to healthcare settings, and to bring those forward to anyone who's interested, you know, at the senior management level that's interested in doing evaluation and reflection on an organization. And it takes time, and it takes discussion, and it takes changing of belief systems, but the work is obviously incredibly important and to engage in.
Thank you. I'm actually going to share a comment from Facebook before I head into what will likely be our last question. So a comment from Facebook from Caroline Bertrand McIvory. I remember when I was thinking of going into social work, a later in life decision for me. Sitting here listening to your research, listening to your statistics, your language, your descriptions, your supportive stance, just brings me back to my days in university. I have so enjoyed listening to what is being said. Thank you both for your presentation today.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you.
And it looks like this is the last question that we've received thus far. So this is from Jason St. Clair. Will your research be shared with shelters to inform them of areas where services provided to queer refugees needs to be improved?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. So we are working on a policy brief. It's in development to share with shelters, because it definitely, as well as, you know, we have been looking for opportunities to engage in training based on the findings for shelter workers, because what we did see is, as it is the point of arrival, so many people that we interviewed have had negative experiences in shelters. And so but we also see the incredible potential with interpretation, through creating safe spaces, through having an understanding of gender non-binary and trans clients. Like, it can really be an inclusive and supportive place to start to connect with resources, to have settlement workers. So there are a lot of recommendations that we would like to make to shelters, and it is a work in progress. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So that appears to be the last question that we've received today for the question period.
So another warm thank you to our speakers, Khadijah and Serena, who shared their research with us and took the time to come out. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to all the attendees. Thank you for participating today. I hope this year's educational forum met and perhaps exceeded your expectations, in spite of the extenuating circumstances, that we were able to support and educate our members. As a reminder, there is a link to a post-event survey available on the college website for you to complete. Following today's event, we encourage you to complete this survey, at which point you will have access to a link to the certificate of participation, which you can fill out and print for your records. Thank you all for your participation.